So, Birmver. Well, in order to talk about Birmver, the first rule is you can't talk about Birmver. I deliberately set the play area, this area right here, uh, to include large portions of Birmver because I absolutely had no idea what I was going to do with it. Like I mentioned, I knew what I was doing with Glendow. I had a pretty good idea of what that land was going to be like. I have very good idea of Kandrakar, and at the time I was working on ideas for Wen. So it was very obvious that Wen was going to be Chinese influenced. It's specifically from the generator itself said that the Wen were the Chinese culture. But I was going through websites. I was reading Wikipedia. I was reading websites about Chinese mythology. And I was reading some Legend of the Five Rings books, which is more Japanese, but there's some ideas I wanted to explore there. For example, the Dragon Clan in Legend of the Five Rings is very mysterious. They live up high in the mountains, and they're very rarely seen. And that was kind of the idea I had for Wen, because you can see it's a very mountainous terrain. Lots of mountains, lots of hills, lots of forested mountains, very kind of isolated and set apart. And so I was seeing what ideas can I steal from there. And one of my more recent topics of discussion on this channel has been the dragon people, the descendants of the dragon. And wouldn't you know it, the Chinese are called the people of the dragon. So it seemed like that was going to be where I was going to explore for Wen. And I was specifically looking at the role of dragon in Chinese history and mythology, and the fact that there's the two-horned, five-clawed dragon of the emperor, etc. And while going through all of that information, it brought up the obvious idea of the antagonists that I had in mind for various incarnations of the dragon people, which were the giant people. So there are multiple, as I have mentioned just last video, multiple incarnations of every idea. And so in the dragon people idea, there's the idea of them being just better than everybody and, ruling over people. But there's also an idea of them having fallen so far from their heritage that they're actually a small, very weak group. And it's the player characters then adventuring and rediscovering and empowering their draconic heritage that brings them back into power. Well, who was able to subjugate the descendants of the dragons themselves? Giants. Giants and dragons are both very iconic, very powerful creatures in Dungeons & Dragons and in mythology. And so it seems kind of natural that they would have some amount of enmity between them. And wouldn't you know it, the country that borders on Wen is Birmver. It's the only one that really that shares any border. Kandrakar is separated from Wen by a distance. And so I thought, okay, maybe giant people live in Birmver. And at the time, I hadn't yet chosen this as the play area when I had that thought. I was developing Wen before I chose this rectangle. So I'm like, okay, we're going to be over here adventuring out of Glendow, which is the most well-developed part. And then there's just going to be rumors of this Chinese place where dragon people live. And then further on, even way across, very rare rumors about the giant people who live in Birmver. But then, like I said, I decided to develop this section to force me to actually develop Birmver as a country. So, we had this vague notion of Birmver having giant people in it. And then I came across, while doing research on ACKS, I came across a guy whose blog does some articles on ACKS. His name is Wandering Gamist. And for a game that, an ACKS game he was playing, he came up with a custom class. So after the ACKS core book came out, they released a book called The Player's Companion, which had a bunch of new classes in it. And it also included a system for creating your own custom classes. And he used that to create the Valkyrie. And I'm just going to show you the picture here. This is not well, this is exactly the picture that he used. This is not obviously his website. This is womenfighters.tumblr.com, which specifically shows off pictures of women fighters in reasonable armor. So in this case, she's dressed a little inappropriately for the weather, but otherwise pretty cool. So I had this kind of picture in the back of my head. I had the giant people kind of in the back of my head. And that's when the wave function of Birmver collapsed. And now I had a very good idea of what I was going to do. In Birmver, we were going to have giants. We were going to have women who were the descendants of giants. They would actually, they called themselves the daughters of the giant, or the giant daughters, or the Jotundotra. I don't speak Norse, so I'm obviously going to pronounce that in a way that you probably don't think is right, but that's fine. Or the Jotun daughters. And so there were going to be these women descended from giants, literally, and they were going to be the equivalent of these, my old idea for the dragon descendants. They were empowered by this bloodline from these incredibly powerful giant forebears, and they were literally heads and shoulders above everyone else. They were really tall, they were very powerful, they were exceptionally skilled, and they rocked people's socks. Now, one of the things that I had decided, you know what, I didn't notice how straight this line is. This particular map is a 6-mile hex map. If you look at this has more variation to it, but then when it went to the 6 mile, it just went straight down, like perfect. I might add some hexes there. I actually have not modified a single hex on this map. No, I think that's not true. No, I think that's true. I think I haven't modified a single hex on this map. So one of the other things I was missing is, why are these countries here? What is this land? Is this where they started and these countries have naturally grown up on this land from the native peoples, or are they colonizing this place from somewhere else? And given the fact that we have kind of a Viking-influenced Birmver, you'd want them to come from somewhere else. In addition, when you're doing the demand modifiers, the age of the city is one of the modifiers. And there's like 3 or 4 categories, whether it's within 100 years or within 1,000 years or older than 1,000 years or something like that. It's not very granular. But I had at that point just kind of randomly decided that Kandrakar was like 1,500 years old and all the rest of them were 200 years old. So that implies that this is kind of a relatively recent arrival. And otherwise, these people might have been coming from elsewhere. And I decided, since we have these very, this Chinese culture here, which is it's very different from the cultures that I wanted for Glendow and Kandrakar, they probably came from somewhere else. And now that we have this Viking culture, they probably came from somewhere else. And so it's off map. Nobody cares. They come from a different place. Okay, so like I said, the wave function collapsed, and now I had a really good idea of these larger-than-life giant women who have a country across the sea somewhere, and then came and colonized the western portion, the southwestern portion of this land, and set up shop there. And now the people who are here are not necessarily filled with giants anymore. There might be in the capital city, which is down here. You can see that tiny little black speck right there. There might actually be a couple of real giant, the actual Jotun's daughter wandering around in this country. But it's not like there's hundreds and thousands of them wandering around. That's not how it works. Most of them are descendants. The bloodline's been diluted down. Men in their culture are not actually... They don't possess the giant's blood, and so the men are never giants. Only women of exceptional women. Every few generations, you'll have one who actually grows to giant size, etc. So most of the rest of them, now the women are still going to be bigger than your average woman. So in their culture, women tend to grow as large as men do. and the men actually tend to be a little bit smaller than the women. A little bit. They're very close. Men and women, it's not a lot of morphological difference between them. And I decided, since they were going to come from kind of Viking culture inspired by those Valkyries and whatnot, I was going to subvert the normal Viking culture where men, there's like, in Viking culture, there was a very big split between what is men's and what is women's. Women were in the home, they did the home stuff, they controlled finances, and then men did things outside of the home. They were the warriors and things like that. And there's I can't remember exactly what it was called, Adri or Adis or something like that. There's a concept within Viking culture of things being unmanly. So, for example, magic. If you were a Viking, I say Viking. Now, I'm going to use the word Viking, but I'm actually talking about like the Norse. It's a slightly different thing. But it's just shorthand to say Viking all the time. But in the Norse culture, there was this concept of unmanliness, and magic was unmanly. So if you were Norse and you practiced magic, you weren't seen as, fully a man. You were seen more, magic was more of a woman's kind of thing. Women weren't able to compete in actual combat. Actually, it was also very bad to attack women in Norse culture. This actually didn't apply when you were a Viking and you were raiding another land, like when they would land and raid England. It was not at all a problem to be violent towards those women, but you were never violent towards other Norse women. So these kinds of things are going to get flipped, not 100%, obviously, because you're going to want the men. A lot of players are going to want to play males, and you're going to want them to be able to play like male warriors and stuff. And so essentially you create a bit of a caste system. So you have these Jotunsdottir. The actual true 100% Jotunsdottir are very rare and hardly ever seen. So then you had the other regular women, and this is a matriarchal society. Women hold most of the positions of power, but they still recognize that you need women to give birth, and women are more valuable for the propagation of the species than man. And so despite the fact that most of the women function as warriors, they still realize that men are the disposable troops. And so there are very large armies of men who kind of serve as the bulk force militia, whereas the women serve as the better trained, better equipped elite units in the military. Excuse me. So you're going to have plenty of opportunity for there to be male warriors and whatnot. And similarly, magic is going to be more of a male thing to deal with. That's them trying to compete with the fact that they don't have the giant's blood in them. So they turn to this, magic to kind of fill in the gaps where they're lacking. But women can women can practice magic in their culture as well. I'm not going to make it 100%. It's just looked down upon. They feel that a woman's place is, she's doing a disservice to her giant bloodline by utilizing magic instead of, actually fighting. Okay, so then on top of all that, we had to figure out, what is this island? Why are people here? And even more so, as we're trying to figure out where to add lairs and dungeons, what are those lairs and dungeons? Like, lairs are easy. There can be a bunch of monsters wandering around, so you can create monster lairs. And in ACKS, they group all of the humanoid enemies under, like, they call them beastmen, so like goblins, kobolds, orcs, ogres, etc. Those are all beastmen. There are still various incarnations of them, but they just call them all beastmen. And so you can have, like, beastmen hanging around and whatnot, but you kind of want dungeons to grow out of something else. So in Trocare, obviously, there's the ruined city of Trocare. There was a city. The various levels of the dungeon actually correspond to real things. It's not just a dungeon for a dungeon's sake. And it pre-existed. but it just happens to now be infested with monsters and whatnot. So rather than there just being dungeons for dungeon's sake, you want there to be something else. And I thought, why were people, now that they're coming and colonizing this land, was there something here before? We need to come up with a history of the actual continent, the island itself. And so I did. And what I decided, and I haven't put a lot of details into it, I just came up with a brief story. There used to be a sprawling civilization on this land. And I equated it to either the Incan or the Mayan empires. So they were mathematically and technologically advanced given their time in history. They spread expansively across this land. There were tons and tons of people who lived here. And then mysteriously, they got killed off. And the way that happened was actually this volcano that just happened to randomly generate literally in the middle of the island. That didn't exist in the past. There was no volcano. These guys, this civilization that was thriving all across this land, was destroyed by a volcano that erupted in the middle of the island, spreading ash and lava and everything, and essentially just killing off this whole region with the poisonous fumes and the fire and all that fun stuff. So basically a brand new volcano erupted and wiped out this civilization. However, its ruined buildings and stuff can still exist here. That also explains why there's so much forest in this land. It's because the volcanic ash over the centuries has created very fertile soil, and everything has kind of forested over and grown up. It's kind of hard to see here, but let's see if it looks any better on the other one. Okay, we can zoom in a little bit more here. If you notice in the center, there's the volcano, and there's a little bit of mountains around it on this side. But then on this side, most of this is actually just forest and jungle. And then you have further out, again, mountains. So if you zoom out here, you can see there's kind of like a ring of mountains around the central mountain. And then most of this through here is kind of flat land. And so I decided that when this volcano or whatever it was showed up, it billowed up and raised a bunch of these. It built up. Trying to use words here. It billowed up and bubbled up, and this entire section through this area of land rose way up, and then it burst, and it kind of fell in on itself, and just the center ended up having those mountains, and then there was that ring around it. I say whatever this thing is because I haven't decided if it was just a random volcano erupted or if there's going to be some other, more deliberate process behind it. Somebody trying to destroy this island, some ancient god trapped beneath the island, and his evil bubbled up and burst out and killed everybody, etc., etc. The only people that existed and have survived since that time is actually Kandrakar. These mountains existed. These are actually dormant volcanoes, but they erupted as well. They were extra spots that had popped up. But Kandrakar was a very fortified mountain city. They lived underneath the ground. The lava wiping out life on top of the ground didn't affect them as much. And so the dwarves have been here ever since. And up until a couple hundred years ago, they were the only people, the only civilization in this land. And so they have a very well-developed civilization. They actually have some idea of what used to be on the land, although they didn't really pay much attention to the rest of the continent. They're a very insular people. But they actually have the largest city here, too. Despite the fact that Kandrakar is actually one of the smaller countries, their people are highly concentrated in the gigantic city of Kandrakar, which actually is an entire mountain inside and out. So I knew this is all backstory that I came up with. So essentially, 1,000 years ago, somewhere between 200 and 1,000 years ago, A giant eruption occurred. It wiped out the civilizations on this island, with the exception of the survivors of Kondrakar. The island's topography had changed. Now there were more mountains than just this section, because now you had this ring of hills and mountains rising up around the volcano, as well as the one in the center here. And the ash had covered the island, and over time had created fertile soil, and so now you have all of these forests and forests and jungles and stuff growing up through here. And what was left of the people in the civilization from before, which I don't have a name for, they over time devolved into some of the beastmen and other creatures that live throughout the island, tainted by whatever evil had come up with the volcano. However, there were and are still pockets of man-like people, actual men, around here, but they have completely lost what their society used to be. So, for example, there used to be the giant Mayan civilization. It was very advanced, etc. It mysteriously fell and collapsed and died off, except there are still Mayans who live, in Central and South America. So just because the Mayan civilization fell didn't mean that every single last Mayan is dead. So these people over the centuries have eked out a living. But like I said, they're twisted and corrupted by whatever tragedy befell their civilization. The details to be determined later. And that brings us to part of Birmver. Let's see where we are. We're 21 minutes in, so we can cover this next part. So I decided that in Birmver was going to have the giantesses and the Viking kind of civilization, the Norse civilization. And they arrived and set up their city here, which I have a list of names I generated. They're actual Norse settlement names, towns and whatnot, from history, which I just randomly generated a bunch, and I'm going to start assigning them as we populate our map. But those kinds of people are over here. We will be adventuring over here, and that's a different set of people. So when the people arrived, which I don't have a name for their civilization yet. I've just basically been calling them the Birmver, which is the name of this settlement and not actually their name. And I've also been calling them the Jotunsdottir, which, again, that's a specific set of people, not necessarily their entire culture's name, but we'll figure that out later. I know in the Aran Empire campaign setting, I think it's the Aran Empire campaign setting, there are some Viking-like people that live by the Jutting Mountains, or the Jutland Mountains, and I think those are the Skanuck, Skanuck, which, I don't want to use that because it sounds like Canuck, and then people think they're Canadian. So, when they arrived, they found humans living here. The remnants, the people who had survived the collapse of civilization, eking out a much lower tech, much more meager existence in the plains and farmland over here. And those people, there were initially some skirmishes and whatnot, but they were vastly outclassed by the Jotunsdottir, and so they joined with them. And these men, this civilization was called the Voss. And they form the bulk of the people in Birmver now. Over the past couple hundred years, the Jotunsdottir have intermarried with the Voss, and so you have this subclass of the Voss. The Voss themselves have enemies, another set of people that live in these hills sections. I guess not this hill section since it's part of Birmver, but in the hills outside of Birmver's borders, and those are the Varsk. And the Varsk they were not allied with the Voss. The Voss and the Varsk were in war with each other. And since the Voss have allied with the people in Birmver, now the Varsk are their enemies because of that. And it just so happens that the Varsk are also the more evil and corrupted, because they were closer to the volcanic eruption. They are more corrupt and evil than the Voss, who were much further away. So, what else we got here? Oh, some of this was inspired by one of my favorite fantasy book series, which is called the First Law Trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. And in that book, well, that's the first 3 books. One of the main characters in those books was from a kind of Norse-inspired culture up in the Northlands. And there was another book called The Heroes. And essentially, it goes... The whole book is stories about these guys up in the Northlands. And what I really loved about them is, in the Northlands, they have Carls and Thanes and whatnot, so it's definitely Norse-inspired. And as a warrior, you would join somebody's band of warriors, and then the Northmen would always constantly be at war with each other. Different clans, different companies of men would get hired by various regents and fight each other all the time. And among these, the heroes, the eponymous heroes of the book, were what were called named men. So you would join as just some random guy, and then during these campaigns, during these fights, if you did something worthwhile, you could have a name bestowed upon you by a named man. Only a named man can bestow a name upon another man. So, for example, one of the characters in the book is called the Dogman. And they call him the Dogman because he's very good at tracking people. So at some point in the past, somebody decided to call him the Dogman. There's another guy who got the name Shivers. And a lot of people, he shows up in the other books in the series, and people think that he's called Shivers because he's such a stone-cold badass that he sends shivers down people's spines with just a glare. But in actuality, in one of his very first forays out with a group of men in combat, he fell in an icy river, and he basically caught hypothermia and actually caught the shivers. And so they called him Shivers. He hates the name, but he's happy that it's gotten a different connotation over time. And I've always wanted to run a campaign where the players get to essentially create named men, but through play. Something cool has to happen in the game, and then your character can have a name bestowed upon him. Presumably, I'd have the party figure it out. So I wanted that to be one of the things here. And it just so happens that there's the group of Northerners that are the more civilized version, of which, like, the character Shivers and the Dogman and Logan Ninefingers, known as the Bloody Nine, where they all live. And then further north from them, there are the hills and the hill people. And the hill people have a somewhat similar culture, but they're much more wild and much more insane. And you meet a few of the hill people when you're reading the book. And it just so happens that we've got people living here, and to the north, there's hill people, and they're on the other side of the border, so they can be even crazier and evil. And so that's where I like incorporating that idea here, too. That's why I like developing all these ideas, and then I just kind of mix and match them together. So we got giant people and the named men mechanic all going through here. And it works in their culture, too. So the men in this culture are looked down upon compared to women, and they don't get to inherit the giant's blood like women do. But so what they do is they give each other names. It's a way to, from one man to another, to give a little bit of respect and recognition to another man. And so that's their culture, especially since the giant's daughters have moved in. And it also, serves to encourage them to valor and awesome stuff on the battlefield, because they know that if they prove themselves on the battlefield, they can earn a name for themselves. And since it's done on the battlefield in service to, presumably one of the giant's daughters, cultural descendants, I feel like the giant's daughters would, what's the word I want here? Indulge them in it. So they're fine. Yes, if a man proves himself on the field of battle, then yes, we will acknowledge him as more than just, normal man cattle. I like it. So that is Birmver so far. Like I said, I generated a bunch of names. I'm working on the mythology, since players are going to want to know, if you're making a cleric or something, what kind of gods are available. And I'm going through some of that. It's going to borrow heavily from Norse mythology, but because it's switched, I'm not just gender swapping everybody. I'm trying to take aspects of the culture, see where it fits in this whole idea, and then split it out. So, for example, the giant's daughters people in Norse mythology, the giants and the gods are kind of enemies, and so they're not going to acknowledge the gods, like worship Odin and Thor and those guys. So I have to find a way to differentiate that, and that's what I'm working on. So until next time, bye bye.